The sky was gray, and a soft wind blew through the cemetery that morning. Rows of white marble stones stood quietly, like silent witnesses of love and loss. The old veteran walked slowly on the wet grass, holding a small bunch of fresh white roses. His steps were not fast, but they were steady. He wore his dark green military jacket with patches on both shoulders and several medals on his chest. It wasn't a fancy jacket. It was the same one he had worn for years during important ceremonies. Today, however, it was not about a ceremony. Today, it was just him, his memories, and the woman he loved. He reached the grave and knelt down carefully. The stone had his wife's name carved on it, a name he had whispered 1,000 times in his prayers. She had passed away only a few months earlier. He still spoke to her every day, but this was the first time he came on the day they had promised to meet each year. When they were younger, they used to talk about growing old together. They talked about their dreams, their kids, their small house, their garden, and how they would one day rest side by side. Now she rested here, and he came to keep his promise. He laid the roses gently on the ground. His hands trembled as he touched the stone. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered softly, as if she could still hear him. His voice was cracked and slow. "I brought your favorite flowers." "White roses. You always said they looked pure." His eyes filled with quiet tears, but he didn't let them fall right away. He placed one hand on the stone, and for a moment it felt like he wasn't alone. A few people passing by slowed down to watch him. Some recognized the medals, some simply nodded with quiet respect. They could tell this man carried history on his shoulders. He wasn't a stranger. He was someone who had served his country. But on this morning, he was just a man missing his wife. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The sound of distant birds and rustling leaves filled the silence. His memories returned like an old film. The first time he met her at a small cafe, their wedding day. The way she used to wait for him at the airport when he returned from duty. He remembered her smile, the way she held his hand even in the toughest moments. She had been the strong one, the warm one, the one who kept their family together when he was far away on missions. As he sat quietly on the ground, 2 police cars pulled up near the cemetery's entrance. The officers weren't there for a funeral. They were on a routine patrol, but from the corner of their eyes they noticed a man kneeling by a grave. One of them narrowed his eyes. He didn't see a veteran. He didn't see the medals or the love in that moment. All he saw was someone he didn't trust. The veteran didn't notice them at first. He was too lost in his thoughts. He softly cleaned the edges of the gravestone with his old handkerchief, something he always carried in his pocket. It was an act of love, small and gentle. He whispered a few words to the stone, talking about their children, about how the world kept moving even though he still felt stuck in time. He promised her that he would keep visiting, that he wouldn't let her be forgotten. Then he slowly stood up. His knees hurt, but he didn't complain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded letter. It was something he had written the night before, sitting alone in his living room. It wasn't meant for anyone else, just her. He placed the letter next to the flowers, pressed it down gently with a small stone, and straightened his back. That was the moment the officers started walking toward him. Their boots made a sharp sound on the gravel path. He finally looked up and saw them approaching. For a brief second, he thought maybe they were just passing by, but they kept coming closer. 2 young officers in uniforms, hands resting on their belts, expressions hard and unreadable. "Sir," one of them called out. His tone wasn't kind. It was sharp, like someone talking to a stranger who didn't belong. "What are you doing here?" The veteran blinked in confusion. I'm visiting my wife," he replied softly. His voice carried no anger, just honesty. He even pointed to the grave behind him. But the officers didn't look at the name on the stone. They didn't notice the flowers or the letter. "Do you have an ID?" the other officer asked, stepping closer. "Yes," the veteran said, reaching slowly into his jacket. Of course. He wasn't nervous about showing his ID. He had done nothing wrong. But there was something cold in their eyes that made the air around him feel heavier. "Why are you out here alone?" the first officer said, scanning the area like he was looking for a reason to be suspicious. The veteran frowned softly, not understanding why he was being questioned. "This is a cemetery," he said quietly. "People come alone all the time. I just came to see my wife." Behind the officers, a few passers-by stopped. They sensed something strange happening. It didn't look like a normal talk. The officers had their hands close to their equipment. The veteran was still holding the corner of his jacket where his ID was. "Sir, step away from the grave," the second officer ordered. The veteran took a small step back, not out of fear but to show he was listening. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, still calm. But inside a small ache started to grow. He had come here for peace. Not this, not a scene. Not on her day. The wind picked up again. His metals lightly clicked together. One of the officers glanced at them but didn't seem to care what they meant. He was already convinced something was off. An older man from across the cemetery shouted gently, "He's a veteran. Leave him be!" But the officers ignored him. The veteran lowered his eyes for a second, whispering to the stone again, "I'm sorry, sweetheart." It was not something she could answer, but he said it anyway. He never liked conflict. He had faced worse in war, but nothing felt as cold as being treated like he didn't belong at the place he came to grieve. The tension grew like a storm cloud. People could feel it, even if they didn't know what was about to happen. The veteran straightened his back, trying to keep his dignity. His late wife had always told him to hold his head high no matter what, so he did, even now in front of people who didn't see him for who he truly was. At that moment, everything felt quiet again, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. The kind of silence before something big happens. The veteran stood between love and judgment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight back. But his eyes said everything. He was a man who had already given so much for his country, and now, even here, he had to prove he belonged. 7 minutes earlier, this had been just a quiet visit. 7 minutes later, the whole place would look completely different, but right now it was just him, the stone, and 2 officers who didn't understand the weight of the story they were walking into. And deep inside, the old veteran silently promised his wife again, "I'll stay strong." The veteran stood there, his hands calm, his eyes tired but steady. He had faced hard days before. He had stood in places far colder and darker than this cemetery. But he never expected this quiet morning to turn into something that would test his dignity. The officers kept walking closer, and the space around him started to feel smaller. The cemetery, once silent and peaceful, now felt tense. The sound of their boots crunching on the gravel echoed between the stones. The veteran could feel other people's eyes on him. People who didn't know what was going on but could sense something wasn't right. "Sir, I'm going to ask you again," the first officer said in a firm voice. "What are you doing here?" "I already told you," the veteran answered gently. "I'm visiting my wife's grave. That's all." The second officer tilted his head slightly as if searching for something suspicious in that simple answer. "Do you live around here?" he asked. The veteran nodded. "Just a few blocks away. I come here often. This is my wife's resting place." His voice softened when he said those last words, and he pointed to the stone. The flowers and the folded letter were still resting at the base of it. The first officer ignored the grave. "This cemetery doesn't allow people to wander around after hours," he said. The veteran frowned. "It's not after hours," he replied quietly. "The gate was open. I checked." "It doesn't matter," the second officer replied, shaking his head. "You're making people uncomfortable." "We got a call." The veteran blinked. "A call?" he asked softly, surprised. "About me?" He looked around at the few people nearby. Some were watching with concerned faces, but none of them seemed afraid. "You're standing here alone, acting strange," the first officer added, "and we don't know what you're carrying in your jacket." At those words, the veteran's heart tightened. He slowly opened his jacket and raised both hands a little to show that there was nothing threatening inside. "Just my ID," he said quietly. "And some old pictures." The second officer stepped closer anyway, his hand resting on the device clipped to his belt. "Show us your ID now," he said. The veteran nodded and reached slowly into his inside pocket. His movements were calm and careful, the same way he had been trained years ago when everything required discipline. He pulled out his worn wallet and handed it over. It had a small military emblem on it. One of the officers took it, flipping it open roughly. The card inside clearly showed his name, his age, and a small symbol that identified him as a veteran, but the officer didn't react to it with respect. He barely looked at it. "This doesn't mean anything to me," the officer muttered under his breath. The veteran heard it, and something inside him sank. He didn't need to be praised or saluted, but basic respect? He thought at least that would still mean something. He had worn his country's uniform with pride. He had buried friends who never came back home. And now he was being treated like he didn't matter. "I'm not doing anything wrong," the veteran said softly, steadying his voice. "This is a public cemetery. I came to talk to my wife, please. Just let me be." But the officers didn't back away. Instead, the first one stepped even closer, his face stern. "You're not listening to instructions," he said sharply. "Step away from the grave." The veteran stepped back again, though he still didn't understand why. His boots brushed against the edge of the grave marker. He raised his hand slightly to show he wasn't resisting anything. "I'm listening," he said quietly. People started gathering now. Not a big crowd, but enough to make the air feel heavier. Some whispered to each other. One older woman placed her hand on her chest, shaking her head as she watched. "You need to come with us for a quick check," the second officer said. "For what?" the veteran asked, confused. His voice was quiet, not angry. "Just tired. I didn't break any law. I didn't bother anyone." The first officer tilted his head. "Stop arguing and comply." The word arguing didn't feel right to the veteran. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't made any move that could be seen as a threat. But the officers were looking at him as if they already decided he was guilty of something. He remembered something his wife used to say to him when she wanted to comfort him during hard days. "Stay calm, breathe. Don't let the world take away your peace." So he took a slow breath and kept his hands where they could see them. The first officer suddenly stepped closer, too close. He grabbed the veteran's wrist to pull him aside. It wasn't a violent grab, but it was forceful enough to make him stumble. The veteran quickly steadied himself. "Sir," the veteran said softly, "I'm an old man. I just came to talk to my wife, please." But the officers didn't seem to hear him. "Turn around," one of them said. "Why?" "Just do it," the officer replied. The veteran's hands shook, not out of fear but out of heartbreak. How had a quiet morning turned into this? Why was a man kneeling at his wife's grave suddenly a problem? He slowly turned halfway, trying not to trip on the edge of the grass. One of the officers reached for the device on his belt again. The veteran didn't even see it happen at first. There was a flash of movement. A sharp clicking sound filled the air. In the blink of an eye, he felt a jolt shoot through his body. His legs buckled beneath him. The world tilted sideways and he fell onto the damp grass. The flowers scattered from where they were placed. The folded letter shifted slightly from the breeze. People gasped. A woman cried out, "Stop! He didn't do anything." The veteran didn't scream. He just lay there, stunned and humiliated. The wet earth pressed against his cheek. The pain wasn't just physical, it was something deeper. Something heavier. He had fought for years, worn medals, saluted flags, and lost friends. And now he lay in front of his wife's grave as if he were a criminal. The first officer stood over him, breathing hard, though the veteran had never once raised a hand. The second officer knelt down, checking his pulse not out of concern but as part of procedure. The veteran tried to speak. His voice came out cracked. "Please, stop." The crowd grew louder now. Phones were out, recording. One man yelled, "He's a veteran. Look at his jacket." The medals on the veteran's chest glimmered faintly in the cloudy light. They were real. They had weight. They told stories of service, loyalty, and sacrifice. But to the two officers, they meant nothing in that moment. A teenage boy standing with his father whispered, "Why are they doing this to him?" His father shook his head slowly, his jaw tight. The veteran closed his eyes for a second, not because he wanted to give up, but because he needed to breathe. He whispered softly in his heart, as if talking to his wife, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't want this." Then something shifted in the air. People were not just watching anymore, they were reacting. Someone shouted, "Call the base!" Another person was already on the phone. The video was being shared online within seconds. And while the veteran lay there, the sound of distant boots echoed in someone's mind, and not here yet. But soon, this moment, these minutes of cold misunderstanding, would not be the end of the story. It would only be the moment before everything changed. The officers didn't realize what was coming. They didn't know that every Marine in the nearby base was about to hear what happened to one of their own. The veteran still lay quietly on the ground, breathing slowly, his body weak, but his spirit not broken. 7 minutes earlier, it was just him and his wife's memory. Now the whole world was watching, and far away a call was being answered. The old veteran lay on the cold ground, breathing slowly. His body ached where he had fallen, and the damp grass stuck to his jacket. The sound of people talking around him grew louder. It wasn't just whispers anymore. People were upset. They were angry. Some had their phones up, recording everything. Others were trying to step closer, but the two officers held their ground. "Step back," one of the officers shouted. "Stay where you are." But no one moved back. Everyone had seen enough to know something was wrong. An old man in a decorated jacket was lying next to a grave, his face pale but calm. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't yelling. He was simply there, trying to breathe. A woman in her 30s rushed forward despite the officers yelling. She stopped just a few steps away and spoke loudly so everyone could hear. "I know who he is. He's a veteran. My brother served with him years ago." The veteran slowly turned his head. He recognized her face faintly. She had been a little girl back then when her brother and he used to write letters from overseas. She had grown up now, but the spark of recognition in her eyes made his heart feel a little less alone. The officer snapped at her. "Ma'am, step back." But she didn't move. "No," she said firmly. "You can't do this. He's done nothing wrong." People started murmuring louder. One man pulled out his phone and said, "I'm live right now. Thousands are watching. You can't hide this." The officers shifted uncomfortably. They had control of the old man, but the crowd wasn't just going to watch silently anymore. The woman crouched down slowly, careful not to alarm the officers. She didn't touch the veteran but spoke gently to him. "Sir, it's me, Clara. My brother Mike used to serve with you. Do you remember?" The veteran blinked slowly. His voice was soft but clear. "Mike, yeah. Mike used to send you drawings from base." Her eyes filled with tears. "Yes, I'm here. I'm calling the base." She quickly pulled out her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. Her brother still had friends at the local Marine base, and she knew exactly who to call. The phone rang only once before someone picked up. "Clara?" a deep voice said on the other end. "It's happening again," she said quickly. Her voice shook, but it was steady enough to get her message across. "They tased him. At the cemetery. He's down, and they're not listening." The person on the other end didn't waste a second. "Who?" "Mr. Davis, the veteran. Mike's old friend." The voice grew serious. "Where exactly are you?" She gave the location fast. Before she could even end the call, the voice said, "Stay put. We're coming." The moment she ended the call, she knelt down again. "Sir," she whispered to the veteran. "The Marines are coming." The veteran took a slow breath. His body was weak, but his spirit steadied a little. He had stood with his brothers and sisters in hard times before. And now, even without asking, they were coming for him. One of the officers looked at her with suspicion. "Who did you just call?" Clara met his gaze without fear. "People who actually respect him." The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Meanwhile, another young man in the crowd began to speak loudly to everyone around. "We're not leaving. We're staying until they stop." A small group of people nodded. Some stood in front of the veteran, forming a soft barrier between him and the officers. The officers called for backup on their radios, but the tone in their voices was different now. Not confident, but uneasy. They didn't know what was about to happen, but they could feel something was coming. The veteran's breathing slowed down. The first wave of shock had passed. He opened his eyes fully now, looking at the cloudy sky above him. He whispered softly, almost like a prayer, "You'd laugh at this, sweetheart. You'd tell me to get up." He imagined his wife's warm smile, the way she used to touch his arm whenever life got heavy. That memory gave him strength. A soft voice next to him said, "They're on their way." Clara sat on her knees, still close but careful. The officers tried to speak louder again. "Everyone needs to back away. This is a lawful order." But the people didn't budge. A man in a gray jacket replied, "Lawful? We saw everything. This man didn't do a single thing wrong. You can't just treat someone like that." One of the officers glanced at the other, unsure. This wasn't going the way they had imagined. Meanwhile, at the nearby Marine base, the phone lines were lighting up. A few Marines who had served with the veteran years ago were already gathering. A young Marine sergeant who grew up hearing stories about Mr. Davis called out to his team, "He's down. They heard him at the cemetery." Within seconds, a group of Marines moved fast. It wasn't official orders. It was something deeper, loyalty. One of their own was in trouble. They didn't plan to fight. They planned to stand. Back at the cemetery, the veteran tried to sit up slowly. Clara helped by placing her hand on the grass next to him, giving him balance without touching him too much. Afraid the officers would react again. "I can stand." the veteran whispered. No, Clara said softly. Wait for them. Just a few more minutes. The crowd was fully on his side now. People started speaking louder, calling out the injustice they had witnessed. Why would you tase an old man? Someone shouted. He was visiting his wife, another added. One woman began streaming live, describing everything she had seen from the beginning. This is what's happening right now. An old veteran is lying on the ground while they treat him like a threat. Look at him. Does this look like a threat to anyone? The officers were now surrounded by phones, faces, and firm voices. The confidence they had earlier was melting away, and then, far in the distance, the sound of heavy boots on gravel. Clara lifted her head. They're here, she whispered. A group of Marines in uniform marched through the gate. They didn't run. They didn't yell. They walked in silent, firm steps, and the kind of silence that carried strength. People started parting to make way for them. The officers turned around, their expressions changing instantly. The first Marine at the front was a tall man with broad shoulders. His eyes didn't wander. They went straight to the old veteran on the ground. Behind him were 5 more Marines, each walking in perfect rhythm. Clara exhaled with relief. Told you they were coming, she whispered to the veteran. The veteran looked at them and his lips trembled for a moment. Not from fear, but from something stronger, a feeling of not being forgotten. The crowd grew quiet now, not out of fear, but out of respect. Everyone could feel the change in the air. It was as if the entire place shifted. The officers stepped back slightly. One of them spoke into his radio quickly, his voice shaky. We have multiple military personnel approaching the scene. The lead Marine stopped just a few feet away from the veteran. He didn't need to say anything at first. His presence spoke louder than words. He bent down slightly and said, Sir, we're here. The veteran gave a weak smile. Took you long enough, he whispered with a small laugh even through the pain. The Marine smiled back gently. You trained half of us. Of course we came. The officers now realized this was far bigger than a quiet morning patrol. What had started as a moment of disrespect was about to turn into something they could not control. The Marines formed a line, shoulder to shoulder, around the veteran. They didn't touch the officers, they didn't shout. They just stood, solid, unshakable. The veteran slowly sat up fully, supported by Clara and the Marine standing behind her. One of them placed his own jacket under the veteran's arm to help him stay upright. You're safe now, sir, the Marine said softly. The crowd began to clap softly. It wasn't loud. It was steady, respectful, and powerful. Even people who didn't know the veteran felt the weight of this moment. It wasn't just about one man. It was about what he represented. The officers looked around, realizing they were surrounded, not by violence, but by honor, respect, and truth. The old veteran closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. The scent of flowers still lingered near the grave. He whispered softly, I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm okay now. What had started as a moment of humiliation was turning into something different. The people had united. The Marines had arrived, and the man who came to mourn was no longer standing alone. The wind moved softly through the cemetery trees as the Marines stood in their silent line. Their presence changed everything. Just a few minutes earlier, the veteran had been lying on the ground, cold, humiliated, and alone. Now he was surrounded by people who respected him, people who knew what it meant to stand together. The lead Marine, a tall man with calm eyes, crouched down beside the old veteran. Sir, he said gently, we've got you. You're not alone. The veteran took a slow breath, his body still weak from the shock earlier. I didn't expect this, he whispered. We don't leave our own behind, the Marine replied. His voice was steady but kind. The crowd around them had grown larger. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others held their phones tightly, still recording everything. Nobody dared speak too loudly now. The silence carried a strange weight, the kind of silence that happens when something important is unfolding. The 2 officers who had tased the veteran stood a few feet away, their expressions stiff. Their earlier confidence was gone. One of them kept glancing at the gate as if hoping someone else would come and take control. But nobody did. It was their mess, and now they had to face it. Another Marine, a younger one with a firm jaw, took a few steps forward. He didn't raise his voice. Who's in charge here? He asked calmly. The first officer swallowed. "We're handling this situation," he said quickly. The Marine tilted his head slightly. "Handling it?" His calm voice carried more power than if he had shouted. "This is a grieving veteran on the ground. I see a man who came to honor his wife, not a criminal." The officer tried to reply, but his voice cracked slightly. He didn't comply." The Marine raised an eyebrow.
"He didn't comply?"
"Or you didn't listen." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Everyone had seen what happened. There was no excuse to hide behind. Clara, still kneeling near the veteran, looked at the officers with steady eyes. "He told you what he was doing. He wasn't a threat to anyone." The lead Marine straightened up. His uniform caught the soft sunlight that peeked through the clouds. "You tased a decorated veteran in a cemetery," he said in a low but clear voice. "Do you even understand what that means?" The first officer didn't answer. The second one shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the ground. One of the older men in the crowd stepped forward. He wore a cap with the words "Vietnam Veteran" on it. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was strong. "We buried friends for this country. We gave our youth to it. And this man gave everything. You don't tase men like him. You honor them." The crowd clapped softly, not wildly, but with respect. The sound of it felt heavier than thunder. The veteran blinked slowly. He didn't want to cry in front of everyone, but the emotion built up inside him like a rising tide. For a long time he had felt forgotten, like the world had moved on and left old soldiers behind. But here now he could feel their strength around him. A Marine medic knelt down beside him to check if he was okay. "Sir, do you want us to call an ambulance?" The veteran shook his head slowly. "I'm fine. Just a little bruised. I've been through worse." The Marines shared a look. They all knew what worse meant for a man like him. Meanwhile, more officers arrived at the scene, but they didn't approach the Marines carelessly. They saw the crowd. They saw the cameras. They saw the medals on the veteran's jacket. And they understood quickly. This was no ordinary situation. The new officer in charge, an older man with silver hair, walked in slowly. His face showed that he understood the seriousness of what had happened. He approached the veteran with careful steps, not like the first two. He removed his hat and knelt down slightly, showing respect. "Sir," he said softly, "I'm truly sorry. This should have never happened." The veteran looked at him. There was no hatred in his eyes, only tiredness. "I just came to see my wife," he said quietly. "That's all I wanted." The older officer nodded, his voice low. "And you had every right to do that." The lead Marine stepped forward slightly. "This man wore the uniform," he said firmly. "He stood for this country when it needed him most. And today your department humiliated him. You can't walk away from that like it's nothing." The older officer didn't argue. "You're right," he said. He turned toward the two younger officers who had started all of this. "Hand me your badges." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The two officers froze. "Sir," one of them started to say. "Now?" the older officer interrupted. His voice carried no anger, only cold authority. The officers slowly unhooked their badges and handed them over. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. The veteran looked down at the grass beneath him. The flowers he had brought for his wife were still lying near the stone, a little crushed from the earlier struggle. Clara noticed it too. She gently picked them up and brushed away the dirt. She placed them back against the grave with care, like someone fixing something sacred. The veteran reached out with a trembling hand and touched the stone again. His voice was soft. "I told you I'd come," he whispered to his wife's name on the marble. "I just didn't know it would turn into this." The lead Marine placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "But you didn't face it alone, sir. You never will." The crowd around them began to hum with quiet conversation. Some wiped tears, some saluted, others simply watched, knowing they had just witnessed something powerful, something that went beyond uniforms and ranks. It was about dignity. The older officer spoke again, addressing the crowd. "An internal investigation will begin immediately. What happened here today is not who we should be. And it won't be ignored." The veteran didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence alone said more than any speech could. He had carried the weight of war, love, and loss. And now the weight of being disrespected, but also the strength of being defended. One of the Marines helped him to his feet. It was a slow, careful movement, but when the veteran stood, the crowd fell silent again. His medals gleamed softly in the light. His posture, though aged, still held the quiet strength of a soldier. Clara stood beside him, holding the small folded letter he had brought for his wife. She placed it gently back on the grave. The veteran looked at the lead Marine. "Thank you," he said simply. "No need," the Marine replied. "We take care of our own." As they began to escort him toward the cemetery gate, the people around slowly stepped aside, almost like a silent guard of honor. Some saluted. Others placed their hands over their hearts. No one spoke loudly. Respect didn't need noise. The two officers who had caused the scene were led away quietly, faces pale. They could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on them. As the veteran passed through the gate, he turned once more to look at his wife's grave. A soft smile touched his lips. "I'll be back soon," he whispered. For the first time that day, his heart didn't feel so heavy. Because he knew he wasn't forgotten. He had people, not just Marines, but strangers who had chosen to stand with him when it mattered most. The quiet wind carried through the cemetery once more. But this time it didn't feel cold. It felt strong, like something had shifted. The world had watched. And the world had remembered what honor looks like. The next morning, the sky was bright blue over the cemetery. A soft breeze moved through the trees, and birds sat quietly on the branches as if they too remembered what had happened here just one day earlier. The veteran returned to the same place, this time walking with a cane and wearing his old service jacket again. But today was different. He wasn't alone. When he reached the gate, Clara was already waiting for him with a warm smile. Beside her stood a few Marines, including the tall one who had been the first to kneel next to him yesterday. They didn't come with loud voices or big signs. They came quietly, with the same steady steps they had used the day before. "Morning, sir," the Marine said with a respectful nod. "Morning, son," the veteran replied, his voice softer today, but stronger too. As they walked down the path to his wife's grave, more people began to arrive. Some were neighbors who had seen the video online. Some were other veterans who had heard what happened. And some were just strangers who felt they needed to come, not to protest, but to show support. When the veteran reached the grave, he knelt again, slower than before, placing another small bouquet of white roses. But this time the grass wasn't cold under him. It felt warm because people stood all around, not staring down at him like he didn't belong, but standing behind him, like a wall of quiet strength. He placed his hand on the stone and whispered, "I told you I'd be back. But I didn't come alone this time." Behind him, someone began softly playing a trumpet. It wasn't a formal event, but a simple tune, the kind that makes people stand still without being told. A woman in the crowd began to cry quietly. The sound of the trumpet carried across the cemetery, touching every heart present. The veteran closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his wife, about all the quiet mornings they had spent together, the laughter, the talks, and the promises they had made. She had always told him he was stronger than he believed. Yesterday had shown him that she was right. A local reporter who had recorded part of the incident stood at the back of the crowd. The story had spread fast. People across the country had seen the old man on the ground and the Marines standing beside him. Messages of support had poured in overnight. Veterans groups had reached out. Even strangers had written letters. For the veteran, it wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about something deeper. Being seen. Being respected. Clara knelt beside him. "The world saw what happened," she said gently, "and they stood up for you." He gave a small smile. "I wasn't sure anyone cared anymore," he whispered. She shook her head. "They do. Sometimes people just need to be reminded what real honor looks like." A small boy holding his father's hand walked up shyly. He wore a toy soldier's hat and clutched a small folded note. His father whispered something to him, and the boy slowly stepped forward. The veteran looked at him kindly. The boy held out the note with both hands. "My dad told me you're a hero," he said in a quiet voice. "I wanted to give you this." The veteran carefully took the note. His old hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. Inside, written in a child's uneven handwriting, were just a few words. "Thank you for being brave. He pressed the paper gently against his chest and blinked away the wetness in his eyes. "Thank you, young man," he said softly. "That means a lot." The crowd behind them remained silent, letting the moment breathe. Meanwhile, across town, the two officers who had tased him were suspended from duty. Their actions had sparked not just anger, but a serious conversation. People had begun to talk about respect, about how someone's service and pain should never be ignored. It wasn't about punishment alone. It was about change. The Marine who stood behind the veteran cleared his throat. "Sir, there's something we'd like to do with your permission." The veteran turned to look at him. "What's that?" The Marine stepped forward and nodded toward the other Marines. They opened a small box, and inside was a folded flag, not to replace anything but to honor him. "We'd like to do a small flag presentation here," he explained. "For you, for her, for everything you stood for." The veteran's eyes widened slightly. He wasn't expecting this. "You don't have to." "We want to," the Marine interrupted gently. They unfolded the flag slowly, with careful precision. Every movement was practiced, clean, and filled with meaning. The crowd stood taller. The sound of the wind moving through the trees was the only thing that filled the air. The Marines held the flag, then folded it again with quiet respect. Finally, the lead Marine knelt in front of the veteran and handed it to him. "On behalf of those who never forgot," he said softly. The veteran accepted the flag with both hands. His fingers pressed gently into the fabric. His throat tightened, and for a long moment, he couldn't speak. Then he whispered, "Thank you." Clara put her hand gently on his shoulder. She could feel how much this moment meant to him. One by one, people began to step forward. They didn't speak loudly. They didn't make speeches. They simply placed flowers near the grave, saluted, or placed a hand over their heart. A group of older veterans raised their hands in a slow salute that carried decades of stories behind it. The veteran stood slowly, supported by his cane and by Clara's steady arm. He turned toward the crowd. "I don't have the words to thank you all," he said softly. "Yesterday, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life feeling forgotten, but today I know better. I see you. I feel you. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart." His voice cracked just slightly at the end, but it didn't matter. That single line carried more weight than 100 speeches. The crowd clapped softly. Not loud, not forced. It was the kind of applause that comes from the heart, respectful and steady. The Marine stepped up beside him. "Sir, we're always just a call away," he said quietly. The veteran smiled faintly. "I hope I never have to make that kind of call again," he joked gently, and a few people laughed softly through their tears. As the crowd slowly began to leave, many came forward to shake his hand. Some hugged him. Others simply said thank you. For some, it was personal. For others, it was about what he represented: service, sacrifice, and quiet strength. When the cemetery was almost empty again, the veteran sat down on a small bench near the grave. Clara sat beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The air was warm. The silence was peaceful. "I used to think the world had changed too much," he said after a long moment. "That people didn't remember what things meant anymore, but maybe I was wrong." Clara looked at him with a soft smile. Maybe the world just needed a reminder. He nodded slowly, looking at the grave. "She would have liked this," he whispered. "She always believed people were good." The breeze brushed against the flag folded in his lap. He held it tighter, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. That night, when he returned home, he placed the folded flag on the shelf next to a framed photo of his wife. He stood in front of it for a long time. His house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. He didn't feel invisible anymore. The next day, letters started arriving, cards, small gifts, messages from people he'd never met. Some wrote about how his story had touched them. Some said it reminded them to honor their own parents or grandparents. Some said they were proud to be part of the same country as him. The veteran didn't keep them all for attention. He kept them because each one reminded him that even in the hardest moments, good people show up. And every week after that, when he visited his wife's grave, he never stood there alone again. Someone always came. Sometimes a Marine, sometimes a stranger, sometimes a child with flowers. His quiet act of love had started a wave of kindness he never expected. And so, the man who had once knelt alone in the cold grass now stood as a living reminder that respect, honor, and compassion still live in people's hearts. Sometimes they just need one moment to rise again. The cemetery, once just a quiet place of memory, had become something more. A place where a community stood together. A place where dignity was defended. A place where an old veteran found out that even in silence, he mattered. And when the sun set each evening, the white roses on his wife's grave always caught the last golden light. A small, beautiful promise that love and respect never truly fade.